Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for tuning in to this part two episode of Just Another Tinfoil Hat. I'm your host, Zelia Edgar. The aim of this show is to discuss all aspects of the paranormal, from the relatively mainstream to the downright bizarre, to pose questions and entertain ideas regarding every angle of the unexplained. So hang on to your tinfoil hats, keep your hands and feet inside the saucer, and please enjoy the ride. Tonight, I am very pleased to introduce my guest, Steve Ward. He is a fellow researcher, parishioner at the Church of John Keel, and a very good friend. And Steve, welcome back to part two of my paranormal library.
It's great
very
to be
exciting. Back. So we left off last time with the remarkable cliffhanger of Demonic Reality, which is right here. I will say, too, the dust jacket, which I don't have on me, it's fantastic. I believe it's a classical painting of an infamous biblical scene.
Wrestling with the angel?
Yes, it is.
Ishmael? Or no, Joshua.
So. Joshua, yeah. Right?
Oh, boy. I guess it's been a long time since I've been to Bible school, so forgive me.
Oh, geez. I think we're in trouble. No, but it's truly fantastic, and I feel like it represents kind of the overwhelming concept of this book very well, because it is literally kind of an image of man wrestling with the other. And that's exactly what Demonic Reality is for me. I know it had been on my reading list for a long time. I had had countless people tell me, hey, you should read Demonic Reality. Of course, that's by Patrick Harper, if I didn't say that already. And so, I knew going into it I would really like it. But when I read it, it was so much more than I expected. I actually found it, and this is a little weird, but again, I've been into the paranormal for a long time. It was very moving for me to read Demonic Reality, just the way that it was a compendium of different sightings and different encounters. It was also a lot of theoretical discussion. But really, the point that it drives home to me is that the paranormal and the outside is kind of an inherent part of mankind, our culture, our society, as a whole. And again, it was a very, very moving thing for me to read that. So.
Well, I have finally started it. It's been on my shelf forever, and one of my standing jokes is I have 200 books on my to read now shelf, and that's been one of them. And matter of fact, it was Kevin Nelson of Van Meter Visitor fame and talked about last time. He's the one that I know I'd had it, but he recommended it highly, so it moved up on my shelf. And now I'm finally, of course, I'm reading it with 12 other books right now. So, but yeah, it looks absolutely fascinating. One thing I wanted to mention, while we had talked about John Keel last time, and I just lost my earplug, and it's caught. Okay,
there we go.
This is the original way the Mothman Prophecies looked like with the dust jacket.
So
now,
cool.
This is one I got in the last several years because the dust jacket has pretty much disintegrated, and of course mine has all the original notes in it. But it did not sell well when it came out, and I was one of the ones that waited for it and grabbed it right off a bookshelf in a real bookstore, brand new. So that was absolutely fascinating to me.
Man, yeah. Well, speaking of the Mothman Prophecies, I suppose we should probably just jump right into the John Keel discussion. Try and keep it at, 7 hours about.
Right. I'm ready.
Yeah, so the Mothman Prophecies, of course, is I think what Keel is probably most known for. And, a lot of that has to do with the popularity of the movie, which was very well done. And actually, incidentally, I watched the movie before reading the book, which was interesting because, gosh, when was that? I had read about the Mothman previously, but it had always been billed as a cryptid, and so I'd have all of these just random books from the library on different cryptids and stuff like that. And the Mothman was always listed as some sort of, it's some sort of demented, weird owl creature or something like that. And so then I watched the movie many years ago, and I was like, oh, this is fantastic. But, I'm sure that it was dramatized. I'm sure that it really wasn't this crazy. And so then I was like, I should probably read the book. It sounds interesting. And I realized, no, the movie was not dramatized. I mean, of course it was dramatized, but it was not exaggerated, I guess I should say. That the book itself is far more in-depth and crazy than even the events in the movie. Even though I will say the movie was well done, and I enjoyed it. But.
And I did the reverse. I had read the Mothman Prophecies several times years before, and my first reaction, I was disappointed in the film. I thought they missed so many opportunities, but as time went on, I realized that the screenwriter did a lot of kind of subtle things to get more of the book in. And there are actually, if you get the DVD and look at the extras, there are several deleted scenes where you could see they were attempting to even get more of the ideas in, but for whatever reason they couldn't make the final cut. So it has become one of my favorite films. And and John Keel, he told a friend of his, he was actually, she described him as giddy when he sold this particular one to this, when he saw the script, because he said, it's like they finally got some of the ideas right. He said they've updated it, they've got essentially my character married and so forth, but and he talked about in the afterword to one of the paperback edition of the Mothman Prophecies, when the film came out, that Hollywood had something like eked out a few basic truths or something like that, and it was not an easy task. So he was, besides getting a nice royalty, I think he was pleased finally, and I think he held back for years. He just didn't want to sell to anybody that was going to. Can you imagine? I mean, they even bought Linda Godfrey's "The Beast of Bray Road," just the title, and it's supposed to take place in Wisconsin, and you see all the California cars with California license plates. And it's just a horrible horror movie. I couldn't watch the whole thing. So thank God that the Prophecies was actually handled very well.
Oh yeah, but no. Speaking of prophecies, I wanted to bring up the Eighth Tower. Which, if you think the Mothman Prophecies was a wild ride, and you want an even wilder ride, I would definitely recommend it, because, and I believe I've mentioned this elsewhere, I know I talked about it in my review of the Eighth Tower. This is the book that almost, I say almost, for about 2 weeks I had to take a break from the paranormal after reading the Eighth Tower. I was younger. I think I was 17 when I read it, and there was just, and as we'll discuss in a minute here, you informed me of why it was quite so almost Lovecraftian in how depressing it was. I just, I read it and I was like, half of this is fantastic, because half of it is very much, the theories behind Keel's ideas on the super spectrum and the ultra-terrestrial concept. And then the other half was this almost very paranoid plotline of these almost Matrix-like ultra-dimensional beings that were, using humanity as soul food, quite literally. And I was just like, okay.
That kind of parallels Paul Eno's research, because he looks at these entities as deceptive and projecting different images, but as kind of like parasites in a way. Mm-hmm. But now the Mothman Prophecies, I keep bumping my camera here, the Mothman Prophecies was cut in half by, as Keel says, faceless editors. And so he resurrected some of that. About 2/3 of that went into the Eighth Tower. Now I found out, he told someone I know that they didn't want him just to put that in there. They wanted some kind of a theme or a hook. So he came up with this sort of backdrop to kind of pull it together. And it's not that he didn't believe it or does believe it. It was kind of a literary device to try and get people thinking. That's what he would do. And his thinking wasn't in a state of flux. So, one doesn't know, when he died in, I think, 2009, he never solved the mystery of the Mothman. And he would tell people he didn't know what it was. And he even left the door open a little bit for some possible extraterrestrial intervention. And even the term he used, ultra-terrestrial, was another literary device, he said, which is found in a very obscure interview with Richard Toronto about the Shaver mystery. I mean, another whole topic. But so he was, when you read his writings, in fact, while I'm on it here, there are several collections, anthology collections. This particular one, the Great Phonograph in the Sky, is one of his catchphrases, because he talked about how people have these experiences and they think it's unique. They're the first ones. And if you go back in history or just other parts of the globe, The same things playing over and over again, the same deception, the same messages. And in this one in particular, there's 2 or 3 interviews from different sources that you get a lot of insight into his thinking and so forth. Really, these are all valuable to check out. Um, did you want to bring up Anomaly now while we're
Yes,
on? Yes, okay.
while we are on Keel, which this is simply fantastic. And I have to say thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Because
it finally came down in price after the third-party seller pirates had it for a while.
I mean, again, when I first got into John Keel, after my 2-week break after reading The Eighth Tower, I looked him up and tried to find anything he had ever done. Because, not only as everyone probably knows, I am a massive fan of the man himself. But also, too, his writing style is something that is just, the research is good, but it's also fun to read. And that's the case, I feel, with actually a lot of, the best paranormal authors, is their tone comes through and it's engaging and, their personality, it's good writing, and Keel is definitely evidence of that. And so I found out, hey, he had a newsletter, Anomaly. That's fantastic. I wonder if it's online anywhere. This was some years ago. And I found a collection like this, and it was, I don't remember how much it was, but needless to say, I did not purchase it at the time. So this is it's the coolest thing. I mean,
it is, and I had, I actually had a couple. I still have at least one copy of his original newsletter. And when you read through that, he talks about how he enjoyed this format because he complained about some of the editors and how they screwed up his books, like Trojan Horse, and they just really messed up figures and sometimes. And what do? You can't go back and change it. You can't. Trojan Horse didn't sell well initially, so they weren't going to have a second edition where you could make corrections. But in Anomaly, people could write in and say, "Well, this is incorrect," and he could correct it. He loved doing that. Another thing he did in Anomaly is he would list the magazine articles that were coming out that month in Saga, UFO Report, Mail Magazine, and so forth. By the way, Mail Magazine wasn't what one was probably thinking of. While there may have been a few scantily clad females, but it was mostly about men hunting Bambi. And there was one article where a guy was supposedly survived an attack by army ants or something like that. So it was guys doing macho things, whether it was real or not. But he also would rate them. In one of them, in one of the Mail magazines, he had there was an article. He said, "Don't even buy it." He said they edited, they added stuff in, and they just totally destroyed it.
I know it's funny because even because you've also been so kind to send me copies of some just other articles from the golden age of flying saucer magazines. And it's fantastic because there have been at least 2 of them. I think one was in Flying Saucer Review, and I think maybe the other one was in Sanderson's magazine. That was
Pursuit.
Pursuit, yes. Where Keel would literally write in and be like, "Guys, I'm sorry, the editors." And every time I see that, it just kills me.
He had a hell of a sense of humor.
Oh, it was fantastic. But yeah, and then too, and the fact that he could go in and be like, okay, so this is what I meant to say, and this is what was said. I think that really must have been very nice because I can only imagine how frustrating it would have been. Having to just see what you've written be totally mangled in the editing process. So
yeah, and he would list the upcoming articles in various magazines that were coming out at the time, sometimes 5 or 6, and he would assess them. Sometimes the magazines would really hack them up or add stuff even. The editors would get creative. So, and I remember one of them in one of the magazines, he just said, "Don't even bother with this one." But it's just the more you can't get enough of John Keel. You can't get enough of his thinking, his writing, his personality, and like I always like to quote the great Colin Wilson, great British paranormal investigator. He and Keel were friends. That's another book I didn't bring up, but Alien Dawn by Colin Wilson.
Oh, yeah.
Fascinating book, and it talks about his correspondence with John Keel. And in that book, he says, John Keel is incapable of writing a dull sentence. And I think if you haven't read Mr. Keel, you'll find that that holds true.
And I am going to say too, of course, I'm going to recommend that, John Keel's books are definitely some of my most often referenced, whenever I'm working on anything paranormal related. So of course I'm going to say that it's worth it to have, the books in your library. If you just want to see what all the fuss is about, there are a few of them available on archive.org. I think there's Operation Trojan Horse and possibly, The Eighth Tower under the title The Cosmic Question. So, I mean, because genuinely, not to go on proselytizing the Church of John Keel, but it's definitely worth it. So again, if you don't want to commit yet to purchasing your own copy, definitely go on and just check out his writing. It's totally worth it for anyone interested, especially in the weirder side of the paranormal.
And many of these, like the anthologies, well, and the basic books, Eighth Tower, Mothman Prophecies, Trojan Horse, are also on Audible. I would caution that some of the anthologies are littered with editorial comments, and you can judge for yourself whether or not you think those are valuable. But I find them a little bit annoying, to tell you the truth, in the midst of the golden tones of John Keel, to have those in there. But that's something you can decide for yourself.
We could go on about Keel all day probably, but I think I'm going to take a little sidestep and talk about one of his friends, Ivan Sanderson, who is another of my earlier influences when I kind of started moving more towards the weirder side of things. I started with Sanderson's Invisible Residence. And man, that is, the thing with Ivan T. Sanderson, and it's interesting because I know he and Keel actually, they were working on a UFO book together
Right.
at one point, I think during the 60s or 70s. And for whatever reason, they decided to kind of split ways on that. I think they wanted to preserve the friendship rather than put out a book that neither of them were happy with. And it's interesting because you can see how Sanderson, he first and foremost really was a naturalist. And so even in Invisible Residence, he deals with the high strangeness in a very biological kind of sourced way. And it's the same with Uninvited Visitors, which was simply fantastic.
Right.
But it's so cool how with Sanderson, he had such a logic about him where he was like, okay, well, if this is this and this is this, in Invisible Residence, he has an argument that possibly actual extraterrestrial biological entities are riding here in giant amoeba ships. And the terrible thing is that by following his logic, you can almost see how he arrived at that conclusion.
Right.
But no, and he too, Sanderson actually is the one who coined the term ultra-terrestrial, which I know we discussed in the previous episode.
Let me just quickly introduce a couple other series here. Albert Rosales has written The Humanoids, The Others Amongst Us, and it goes from 01 AD all the way up to 2015, I think. Of course, broken up, and there's about 15 of them broken up in different years. And he categorizes all kinds of, a lot of them are clearly entities connected with what appear to be UFOs or strange lights or craft, but others are not necessarily. But he covers all of these strange entities, and some of them are very kind of steeped in folklore. Others are more what we consider a modern encounter, but they're just fascinating. They're all referenced, so you can find out where he got the source, and it's just indispensable to have those. And I also want to mention the Missing 411 books by David Paulides, and he is the gentleman that has been for several years has been investigating very strange missing person reports, not just people that wanted to get away from civilization or were abducted criminally or whatever, but there's these all, if anybody has listened to him, interviewed or read his books, these are very, very strange disappearances. And the most fascinating ones are the ones, sometimes people don't come back, but they're found miles away, or there's just all kinds of oddities about these. And we don't have time, but there's a certain list, a certain category of things that he looks at. He rejects anything that could be explained conventionally. Fascinating stuff, and some of it borders on the paranormal. Some of it is very similar to like an abduction experience, but these capable people, just vanish when they shouldn't have. and they're never seen again.
Well, I think because those are some actually that I haven't had the chance to read yet, but I've listened to some of his interviews and also seen a few of his documentaries. And I think the thing that just really kind of gets me is that, I mean, there are obvious connections, I feel, to the fairy lore aspect, like especially how he discusses the prevalence of rock fields and gravel areas, which, of course,
Yes.
if you take that a step further to the gravel pits of Kiel fame, and so there's all these just odd little connections, but also, too, I think the overwhelming just vibe of that research is something that is very important to me. It's that the world is a lot stranger than we think it is. That maybe there's something responsible for this, or maybe it's, as Keel often suggested, a natural condition of the planet and the things on our planet. And I think that's one of the most intriguing concepts.
That was a good point. Boulder fields, both are mentioned with the fairies and with people disappearing, picking berries. The fact that dogs didn't like the fairies, and then dogs will not track in some of these cases. The dog will just stop and lay down and not do any further tracking. So it's mind blowing that there's several different points where it's the same thing as suggests with some UFO activity that we're not saying that leprechauns are driving flying saucers.
Yeah.
We're not saying that UFO pilots used to sport little green tunics and little red caps, but it seems like there's a commonality that perhaps the same source is involved somehow, and that's very hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, and with that too, I'd like to circle back around a little bit to Jacques Vallée, who is probably, I mean, as far as like influences on my particular brand of research, I think that it is probably Keel first, and then after that, I would say it's probably Vallée. Passport to Magonia is, I think, probably his most groundbreaking work as far as changing the paradigm of how people view UFO occupants. But I don't know, I really, really loved Messengers of Deception.
Yeah.
That, because I read Passport to Magonia first, and then I read Messengers of Deception. And there is just something about that where, and again, this ties into the concept that I think the paranormal has a lot more to do with us, and we have a lot more to do with it, than we believe at first. And in Messengers of Deception, he really nails down how there has been an influence exercised by paranormal phenomena over society. Now, whether that's a concrete material tie that they're trying to influence, or whether it is kind of a give and take, that remains to be seen. But I know that one, the thing that did it for me too was the last chapter of that, where you could tell, because I feel like Keel was always very involved with the phenomena, and the phenomena was always very involved with him. And it's interesting because you can kind of see how Vallée, I feel like for the first part of his career, he kind of did stand apart from it and he tried to view it. And then as time went on, it slowly kind of worked its way closer and closer into his life. And that's the last chapter of Messengers of Deception, where he discusses synchronicities and coincidences. And of course, to quote Fox Mulder, if coincidences are coincidences, then why do they feel so contrived? So
it's been a long time since I've read that one. I have to revisit it. In the late 80s, early 90s, I think it was, he wrote a trilogy, Confrontations, Revelations, and Dimensions, not necessarily in that order. He revisits some of the Magonia stuff because it had been out of print for so long, but there's much, much more to it. And there's also, he has several volumes of it's called Forbidden Science, where you get to see his journals from the 60s when he's when he was friends with Dr. Hynek and the swamp gas fiasco in Michigan. Later into the 70s, and talking about the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the Francois Truffaut was sort of representing him in the film, Jacques Vallée. But it's just to get his insights and the people that he met and his thinking at the time. It's just fascinating. They're just, and I hope he does, he's done one, 60s, 70s, 80s, and I think he did the 90s. I haven't touched the 90s yet, but hopefully he will go on, because I know he got involved with the Skinwalker Ranch at one point, and I would love to hear his insights into that.
No kidding. Well, I also, too, I have the collection The Edge of Reality, which is a collection of his discussions with Hynek and then several other people. And it's just intriguing to kind of hear, because of course when you write a book, it's your thoughts and everything, but to really just kind of hear his own, like, their own words and their discussions, like their personal discussions on this stuff, is just fantastic. I know the infamous Simonton encounter, probably one of my all-time favorites.
Oh, yes.
Valet brought it up, and Hynek couldn't really remember at first, and so then Valet was like talking about it, and Hynek goes, "Oh, the man from Wisconsin with the pancakes." And at one point in the conversation, he even says, "You and your pancakes," and the folkloric ties. And it's just, to kind of just see that sense, that personal sense of humor is just really, really fun.
In a long time since I read that when it first came out. I remember writing notes into it, and it's funny because I'll go back to these old books and I will not remember writing notes, but it's my handwriting. I think I'm going to mention this one real quickly, and I'm going to have to. The title is very long. I'll hold it up again. 60 Years of Neglected Evidence: Analysis of Global Humanoid Encounter Reports, 1946 to 2006.
Oh, wow.
By Ahmad Jamaluddin. I hope I pronounced it correctly. It's a fascinating book. Unfortunately, it has gone to third-party sellers. You can have one for a couple $100s. For a while, it was available on Kindle, but not anymore. But what he does, he takes Albert Rosales' database that I hold, the humanoids, the others amongst us, and he crunches all the numbers like Keel did. Keel discovered the Wednesday phenomena, where UFOs seem to peak on a Wednesday. Well, he found, a certain a months, I think, where they peak. He found the time factor, that there's a certain time of day that you're more likely to see a humanoid encounter than not, and it's 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. But it's consistent.
Well, I know what I'm doing tonight.
Well, it's consistent in every time zone, implying if his data is correct, if his interpretation is correct, I should say, that the manifestation or the entry point of whatever this is fixed as the globe turns. And the other thing he discovered was that he calls them humanoid migrations. They seem to move across the globe in 8 to 10 year cycles, starting somewhere in South America, moving up to North America somewhere, US or Canada, then over to the continent, perhaps the UK or the European continent, and then into Malaysia and so forth. Anyway, these cycles, you never know where it's going to happen, and it's a relatively closed area, small area, but then it cycles again in another 8 to 10 years. And if these findings are valid, it's kind of mind-blowing. Now, there's not a lot of text in it. There's a lot of charts and so forth, and I guess you can make your own judgments and then maybe compare it to Albert Rosales' information or perhaps other sources.
Wow, that is really amazing. And I mean, too, I think that, that says a lot about the window concept, that there are conditions which happen which allow this phenomena to manifest or be observed, with that idea that it kind of moves around, which leaves the door open too. Of course, there'll be, sightings here and there. It's just kind of like with UFO flaps. It's not like the UFOs ever really go away. It's just that all of a sudden you have a place that has, hundreds of people seeing something in the sky, and then next month we'll be back down to a handful.
Okay, I guess I could bring this up a little. It's one of Timothy Beckley. Timothy Beckley publishes some really, really fun stuff. This was called Weird Winged Wonders, and it's a collection of various reports of winged cryptids, including Brad Steiger, the late Brad Steiger, writing about the Van Meter Visitor.
Oh, wow.
He also did the foreword to the Van Meter Visitor book. And I have an article in here on the Mothman and the Mothman Festival and all that. So there's one chapter, and my smiling face, my picture is even in it, and it's still available from Global Communications, I think. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I would also, you just jogged my memory, wanted to bring up High Strangeness.
Oh, yes.
Which is Mark A. Randall and then some guy named Steve Ward.
Some guy, yeah.
Truly fantastic. Sorry,
well, Mark did he's a graphic artist, mm-hmm. And what he did was he kind of chronicled the events of what happened in Point Pleasant in the middle 60s. There's a piece on John Keel, on Woodrow Derenberger, who contacted supposedly Ingrid Cold, the Mothman, there was a very bizarre sighting near Charleston at the time. So there's all and Mary Heyer, the news reporter that allied herself with Keel. So there's all these different aspects of that time period. And he asked me to write. I did about 4 pieces, and he did the editing and all the other writing. So I have a small part in it, but he's really done a fantastic job. The artwork is phenomenal.
I feel like it really captures just the vibe when you read the Mothman Prophecies. I've never been to Point Pleasant, but I can only assume that Point Pleasant has a very strong, effect as well. And it really, the images and the text together just absolutely captures that. But before I forget too, we keep circling back. We literally could be at this all day. Messengers of Deception, that last chapter where Valet starts talking synchronicities and things like that. I'm currently reading a book which, in my mind, it's very much of a similar vein, and it's The Messengers by Mike Clelland. And if you want to delve into the very synchronistic aspects of the UFO phenomenon, I mean, it is mainly it's told very much from like a lot of personal accounts, but there's a lot of really good research in it too, and a lot of stories from other people who've experienced synchronicities, especially involving owls and the paranormal. And it's absolutely intriguing. And again, it has a vibe that just as I'm reading through it, it captures that feeling of synchronicity, which I've only ever really seen matched in that final chapter of Messengers of Deception. And, a lot of people experience synchronicity, and it's a very difficult thing to pin down in writing, I would say. But the Messengers and that final chapter of Messengers of Deception totally just captured it. So I wanted to bring that up quick before I forgot to.
We're going to end this, and we're going to think, we should have mentioned that, and what about that?
I know. Because, too, we haven't even discussed our other reading things. I'm going to mention one final book before we leave, too, and that is, or before we leave this brand of conversation, to have the final about 10-15 minutes discussing some of our other interests, and that is A Revolutionary Kind of Science by Adam Kisby. Now, I just wanted to bring this up because it's very much unlike most of the other books here. It's not about particular sightings or encounters of paranormal phenomena, but it's a very logical look at why the unexplained and the paranormal in general should be taken seriously and understood. It doesn't propound any, theories as to what this stuff might be, just that it is worthy of mainstream attention and something that's very important to a better understanding of ourselves, the universe, and our place in it. So, again, these are by no means all the paranormal books that I have and have enjoyed and absolutely love and use in my research. But as we are running out of time, I did want to bring up real quick any of our other reading interests. Because I think, too, that, something I've noticed is that with the paranormal, it's really easy to kind of get stuck in a groove with it. And something that's definitely helped me is kind of having almost tangible sort of interests in reading. So, Steve, would you like to start off there?
Boy, we both are huge fans of H.P. Lovecraft.
Oh, yes.
And so I discovered him, I think, in the 70s. There was a resurgence where I think it might have been, was it Lancer Books? I can't remember. A paperback company that started republishing them in anthologies. Then, of course, there had been, and there had a resurgence also of Arkham House. Created by August Derleth. I think that's a Wisconsinite.
Oh, yes.
And they published, I even have a few of those, some nice hardbound volumes. And so anyway, I was, my first Lovecraft story was The Color Out of Space, which was recently made into a film, which I was a little disappointed with. But I was reading it at night, and it was freaking me out. And I thought, well, this is really science fiction horror. It was a science fiction story plot, but it was like a horror story. So I just really became really hooked into all his stuff, including his fantasies, the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, or Kadath, depending on how you want to pronounce it. I was always a fan of science fiction. There's a lot of these days. The armchair fiction, I think, is republishing a lot of the old stuff from the 50s, 60s, 70s. A lot of these used to be in the Ace doubles. There you go. There's one right there. And I loved. Well, I'm a huge fan of the pulp magazines.
Oh yeah.
The old dime novels. Ray Bradbury and Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote in those magazines over the years. H.P. Lovecraft wrote for Weird Tales. Um, and I love the hero pulps. I mean, Doc Savage, right? The Shadow and all that stuff. And I could go on and on, but I have no problem with reading what some consider mainstream trash, and some of it's really good trash. And of course, I'm always been a comic book fan. I didn't really start reading a lot until I was a sophomore in high school. I mean, I would read a book occasionally, but then it's like a light switch went on, and I couldn't. I just became a bookworm. Prior to that, I read comic books like crazy, so at least I was reading something, even though they were in word balloons and they had the great superhero costumes and that sort of thing. But what about you?
Well, speaking of Lovecraft, it's kind of funny, but I discovered so for the longest time, Edgar Allan Poe is, was, never shall be like kind of my soul idol, if that makes sense. I blame it on my Aunt Diane. She recited The Raven to me when I was about 2 years old, and so that's kind of been the backdrop of my life a little bit.
Not
Talk about
exactly a
things,
lullaby. I don't know.
yeah, not so much, but talk about things working into the subconscious. I'm very thankful for that. But no, Poe was like he, has been my idol pretty much ever since then. Of course, I didn't really know that at the age of 2, but then I discovered him fairly early, and his short stories, but especially his poetry, had a huge effect on me. But then H.P. Lovecraft, I discovered around the same time I discovered John Keel. So and my first one was, I think At the Mountains of Madness was actually the first thing that, yeah.
Wow.
And so it's interesting how you have this similar theme, that shows up actually in the Eighth Tower, which does kind of have a very Lovecraftian overtone a little bit. You have the similar theme of these things operating outside of the scope of human consciousness. And, his quote, mankind lives on a placid island of ignorance amid vast dark seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should wander far. I feel like sums up kind of almost the flip side of paranormal research, because of course here you have researchers who are trying to probe that very darkness, that surrounds what we understand currently. What convention dictates this is all that there is. When you step outside that and really start researching, I feel like that is kind of setting out across these vast dark seas of infinity. Maybe it's a little grandiose, but that's how I feel anyway.
Ray Bradbury. I discovered, I knew of Ray Bradbury, and the first short story I read was in a collection by other authors, and the story was called Mars is Heaven. Later on, that same story was incorporated into the Martian Chronicles as the third expedition. But it was classic. It was a school night. My parents told me to shut off the light and go to bed. So I had to find out what happened, because they land on Mars, and it seems like they landed in a little town in Illinois, So I finished it by the light of an alarm clock. I had better eyesight in those days, and I went up them. I was my own kid, man. I wasn't going to be a slave to convention and discipline.
Yeah. Oh man. Well, and I feel like that is the thing with science fiction and horror, because I've just noticed in seeing other paranormal researchers, there seems to be quite a bit of overlap. Not saying that every single one has an affinity for horror, and especially cosmic horror, but I definitely see it a lot. And I think there is something to, so many of these stories are about looking at things from a different angle, or what if even, the Twilight Zone, not a book, but, the actual episodes, so much of it is like, okay, what if things were just inverted? What if things were reversed? And it's this, ability, I feel like, to kind of look at things differently that really kind of shows itself quite a bit in both the genres of horror, science fiction, and paranormal research. And I know too, mythology. When I was young, I read so many of the classic myths and legends. That was probably one of my strongest interests prior to and at the same time I was first getting into paranormal stuff. So that was a huge influence on me as well. And now that I'm getting to this point where I'm looking at the paranormal as a very symbolic sort of phenomena, I'm finding that background has helped me quite a bit And speaking too of the symbolism, recently I'm just starting to get into the works of Carl Jung, and kind of looking at a lot of the ideas that he had, especially regarding archetypes and how that may influence paranormal phenomena. Yeah, that's a lot of it. I mean, I do have that secret collection of romance novels that I was definitely going to
yes,
have.
the ones with the dudes with the rippling biceps.
Yes,
I've got some of those hidden too. I used to pose for those images, but another story. But speaking of mythology, I went to college for a while. I have an associate's degree with 2 proof of purchase seals. But I was taking a bunch of elective courses, and I took Greek mythology, and it electrified me. And from then if I had continued, I was going to declare a major called classical civilization. And I went on to take Greek tragedy and Latin. I was going to be taking ancient Greek. Never got quite that far, but yeah, it was just I had a great professor that taught it, and it was just phenomenal. I mean, Ovid's Metamorphosis, Hesiod's Theogony. This stuff was just absolutely fascinating. And the Odyssey, my God.
Oh my God.
It was Odyssey, especially the centerpiece where he's taken that great journey. And I even was electrified by a book by Ernley Bradford called Ulysses Found, where he goes to the Mediterranean and he believes that Odysseus, at least, was based on maybe several different people, but it represented real places. He would take, went from Troy. They caught a northwesterly levanter, which blew the ship off course, and he could find out where the Cyclops would have dwelled. The Scylla and Charybdis, the several-headed monster and the whirlpool. There's a place there. There are a series of caves that howl like a monster, and right nearby is a whirlpool they call Charybdis. And it's just fascinating, all the parallels.
Yeah.
And that was really a huge influence on me, was taking that course on mythology in college.
Oh yeah, I mean, and it's so intriguing too, because of course the classic Greek mythology that was a huge interest of mine, but then too some of the Celtic myths and legends, ancient Egyptian stuff, and then too my mom, she worked as an archaeologist before I was born, and so she has a huge appreciation and instilled me a great respect for the native cultures of America. So all of that too. If you look at this, all of these different backgrounds and mythologies and belief systems, it is amazing how you start seeing, and this ties into Carl Jung, you see these archetypes start to emerge, these figures that seem to transcend any time or space between them, and how so many, apparently, much like with paranormal, apparently disparate cultures actually have these unifying concepts. So it is just absolutely intriguing. But I suppose, as we are seriously pretty much out of time, I wanted to bring up one more thing, just like Columbo, just one more thing. And that is, you are currently working on a book, as am I. So, Steve, if you'd like to start off with that.
Well, I've got a few sections. I don't know that they're finished. I don't know that they'll ever be finished, but it's essentially I'll be looking at the underlying connections and patterns as we've been talking about, and as people can hear me talk about on my podcast, The High Strangeness Factor, on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. And if you go back in the archives, you might find a few shows that Zelia and I have done together. So, but that's pretty much what it is. I've been talking about the crop circle phenomena and also vehicle stoppages by cryptids, by phantom armies, by UFOs and so forth. There are just so many parallels that connect. And of course, I'm dealing with the folklore connection as well. And now that I've written some of those sections a while ago, when I look at them, I think, oh, I've got so much more to add. And it's going to be frustrating for both of us when the book is done and off to the printer, and then more stuff comes in, or you can't just go and change it. But so I would say look for it by the end of this decade.
Ooh, well, I'm excited.
Yes, so keep your eyes open.
Hopefully both of us won't have to deal with the faceless demon editors that John Keel did, because Yes, too. I'm announcing here and now, as I've mentioned a few times across a few different things, that I am currently also working on a book with Dean Bertram of the podcast Talking Weird and the Midwest Weird Fest. So there will be more details on that shortly. Needless to say, I'm very excited. I mean, something that is probably clear by now, but growing up, paranormal researchers and authors were my idols. I mean, seriously, these are the people that I've looked up to. And so to be writing a book is actually a dream come true for me. It's been a life goal of mine, so I'm just beyond excited. So I suppose with that, Steve, any concluding thoughts?
I'm sure I'll think of something, just masterful to say afterwards. But I really appreciate you having me here on I guess, your flagship show in this
Yeah,
format.
pretty much.
Not your first show by any means, but it has been really a lot of fun to talk about the books that have inspired us and in all ways. And hopefully we can do this again. Actually, I'm not trying to get myself out of a job, but I imagine you could have a lot of guests on that they just talk about their books and what inspired them. Would be a great show as well.
Oh yeah, that's a fantastic idea. But yeah, seriously, thank you again for coming on the show today. I mean, seriously, you were the perfect guest for today to discuss, both of our libraries here. So, and thank you too for all of your help with my research. And just before we part ways here today, a general shout out to all those who have dedicated their time and energies into researching the paranormal. Thank you so very much. Well, everyone, thanks for tuning in to the special edition first episode in this format, My Paranormal Library, with guest co-host Steve Ward. So, Steve, thank you too for being on the show today. Also, to anyone who has sent me books and articles in the past, thank you so very much. And a thank you too to my Patreon patrons. You can keep up with whatever else I'm up to at my website, justanothertinfoilhat.com, and exclusive content is available on my Patreon as well. For today, I am Zelia Edgar, signing off.
Doing.